"Look at him," Preston Calloway said, holding up my tax file like evidence in a courtroom. 3 weeks of digging, and this is the best my son found for a father-in-law? A church bell repairman, worth less than the wine on this table? 400 guests laughed. My son couldn't look at me. What none of them checked was whose name was on the deed to the building they were standing in. I want to tell you how we got to that room. Not the version Preston Calloway had in his file. The real one. 3 weeks before that wedding, Preston sat behind a desk the size of a boat and asked one question. Is he clean? Grant Sutter, his son-in-law, and the man he paid to make sure no embarrassment slipped into the family, slid a folder across the desk. Cleaner than clean, Grant said. Cornelius Ashworth, 68 years old, repairs and casts church bells for a living, owns a workshop worth maybe $40,000 if that. No stocks, no real estate beyond the shop. Bank balance under $6,000 at any given time. Preston opened the folder anyway. He liked to see numbers with his own eyes. No debts, no liens, nothing hidden, Grant continued. I pulled 3 years of tax filings, county property records, even a credit check. He is exactly what he looks like. A poor man who fixes bells. Preston smiled, the way he smiled at contractors who'd underbid a job. Good, he said. Then Tyrell has nothing to be ashamed of marrying beneath him. And neither do we embarrassing the truth in public. He closed the folder. I want this at the reception, not buried in small talk, on the microphone where everyone hears it. Grant hesitated only a second. That seems unnecessary, sir. It's not unnecessary, Preston said. It's instructive. My daughter is marrying into a family with nothing. I want everyone in that room to understand exactly what we're being generous enough to accept. He handed the folder back. Make a copy. I'll want it in my hand that night. That was the extent of the investigation into me. 3 weeks, a licensed private firm, a due diligence officer, who prided himself on missing nothing, and not one of them thought to ask why a man with $6,000 in a checking account had never once in 40 years put his name on a single piece of property he actually owned. I knew about the investigation before Grant finished his second interview. I have people who tell me things. I let it happen anyway. The morning of the wedding, I stood in front of a mirror in my bedroom and put on a charcoal suit I'd bought the year my wife died. I'd worn it exactly twice since. I pressed it myself. I polished shoes that had walked through more foundries than boardrooms, and I told myself the same thing I'd told myself for 40 years not yet. My son Marcus called while I was tying my tie. You almost ready, Pop? Almost. You nervous? No, I said, which was mostly true. You terrified, he said, and laughed the way young men laugh when they mean it. Vanessa's been up since 5. Her father's been on the phone with the venue since 6. I think he's more nervous than I am. I didn't tell him Preston Calloway wasn't nervous about seating charts. I let him have his morning. The wedding was held at the Beaufort Exchange Hall. A restored cotton warehouse the Calloways had turned into the kind of venue that photographed well for magazines. I arrived early, the way I always do, and a young man in a black vest checked a clipboard, found my name, and walked me to a table near the kitchen doors without a word of apology. Table 9. As far from the head table as the room allowed. I sat down. I didn't complain. A man who spent his life listening to metal knows the difference between a sound worth reacting to and a sound worth remembering. Guests filled the room in waves. Lawyers, a state senator, 2 men I recognized from the cover of a business magazine I'd read on a plane once. They looked at my table the way people look at a stain on a tablecloth, then looked away. I watched them the way I watch a bell before I cast it, not with anger, with attention. Marcus found me an hour in, his tie already loosened, his face flushed with the particular joy of a man who thinks the hardest part of the day is behind him. Pop, why are you all the way back here? Come sit up front, there's room. I'm fine where I am, son. You're not fine, you're by the kitchen door. Go be with your bride, I said. I'll see you at the front when it matters. He didn't want to leave. I made him. A father learns when to spend his authority and when to save it. Vanessa passed my table not long after, a folder of paperwork under one arm, something about final vendor contracts, she'd say later, nothing that concerned me. She gave me a smile with no weight behind it, the kind people give a stranger holding a door. I noticed a single page slide loose from her folder onto a neighboring chair before she caught it. I didn't read what was on it. Marcus, standing a few feet away, did just long enough to see the words, "Father-in-law's assets," printed above a line he didn't finish reading, before Vanessa snatched the page back with an apology that came too fast to be nothing. He didn't say anything to me about it. Not then. He just looked at that folder a beat longer than a man looks at ordinary paperwork. And something behind his eyes went quiet the way metal goes quiet right before it cracks. The dinner service began. The noise in the room climbed the way it does at these things, crystal against crystal laughter, with nothing behind it. Then, a little after 9, the lights dimmed at the head of the room, and Preston Calloway walked up to a small stage with a folder tucked under his arm. He tapped the microphone twice. He found my table before he said a single word. His eyes landed on me across 400 strangers, and he smiled the way a man smiles when he already knows how the story ends. He opened the folder. Here is what I know now that I didn't know then. My daughter-in-law had already told my son the truth about that prenup, word for word, 10 minutes before her father opened that folder. She just wrapped it in a lie small enough for him to swallow. That's the thing about people like the Calloways. They don't hide the truth, they just hand it to you dressed as something else. Preston held the folder shut a second longer than he needed to. It's a trick I recognized immediately. I use it myself when I want a room to lean forward before I've said a word. 10 minutes before that, my son had come to find me a second time. Crossed the room, fast weaving between waiters, crouched down at my table like a man delivering bad news at a hospital. "Pop, there's an open seat at table 2. I want you up front." "I'm fine at 9. "You're not fine. You're 40 feet from your own son's wedding." His voice dropped an edge in it now. Preston did the seating chart himself. I checked. I know he did. He looked at me like I'd answered in a foreign language. "You know, and you're not angry?" I didn't say I wasn't angry. I straightened my fork a half inch. "I said I'm fine at 9. Go stand up front with your bride. This isn't the Hill." "Then what is?" I didn't answer that. I've had an answer for 40 years. The room wasn't ready for it. Neither was he. He went back toward the front, but not before I watched him cross to Vanessa, standing near the head table, with a folder still tucked under one arm, even in her gown. I couldn't hear the words. I didn't need to. I read the shape of it the way I read a bell for hairline cracks by watching where the tension gathered. He asked her something. She laughed too fast, the kind of laugh that's really a door closing. "It's nothing, Marcus. Wedding paperwork. You know how my father is." He asked again, quieter. I watched her shoulders go stiff, the way a rope goes stiff right before it takes weight. "Why does it matter what my prenup says about your father's assets?" "He doesn't have any assets. It's a formality." She didn't say it cruel. That's what should have worried him more than it did. She said it the way people say the sky is blue, a fact so settled it isn't worth defending. "Then why does it matter?" Marcus pressed. "If he doesn't have anything, why does your lawyer need a clause about it?" "Lawyers put clauses about everything. It's not personal, Marcus." She glanced past him toward her father, across the room, the way a woman checks a clock she doesn't want to be late for. "It's just paper. Nobody's ever going to read it twice." "I'd like to read it once." "It's not that kind of document." Her voice tightened just slightly, just enough. "Can we not do this tonight?" She excused herself toward the restrooms, folder pressed flat against her side like a hand of cards she didn't want read. Marcus came back to me, jaw working. "She says it's boilerplate. Something about your assets. What assets, Pop? You don't—" He caught himself before he finished the sentence, embarrassed at the sound of it out loud. "Maybe it doesn't mean anything," I said. "You don't believe that. I think you should enjoy your wedding." Not a denial. He knew it wasn't. But the DJ had started the countdown to dinner and there wasn't time left to chase it. He squeezed my shoulder, his mother's gesture, not mine, and walked back into the light. I watched the room the rest of the way. A state senator shaking hands with men worth twice as much and mannered half as well. A woman in blue straightening a centerpiece without seeming to correct anything. Camille Calloway, I'd learned Preston's other daughter married, to a man who'd already decided on paper exactly what I was worth. A waiter refilled my water glass and lingered. Older man, gray at the temples, the kind of quiet competence people stop noticing after 30 years of noticing them. They put you back here on purpose, he said. Not a question. I didn't answer it either. But something passed between us two men who'd spent their working lives underestimated by people holding better silverware. 26 years I've worked events at this hall, he said, setting the pitcher down without being asked. I can read a seating chart the way some men read a Bible. This one wasn't an accident. He topped off my water, though it didn't needed an excuse to stand there a beat longer. You want anything sent back, you let me know. Kitchen's closer to you than it is to them anyway. Then he was gone, moving down the row of tables like he'd never stopped at all. I sat with that a moment. It's a strange thing being seen clearly by a stranger in a room full of people who've decided not to look at you at all. Preston moved through the room like a conductor, working an orchestra only he could hear. He stopped near my table twice, the first time talking to the senator loud enough to carry, "Blood tells, you know. Dress a family up all you want, blood tells." He didn't look at me. He didn't need to. Somewhere behind him, I heard a woman ask her husband in the particular whisper people use when they think a subject can't hear, "Is that him? The father?" Her husband didn't lower his voice much when he answered, "Groundskeeper or something, I heard. Tyrell's a good kid, but Lord, that family." I kept my eyes on my water glass. A man who reacts to every stone thrown at him spends his whole life bleeding. The second time Preston passed, he just looked. The way a man looks at a line item he's already decided to cut. At 9:15, the lights along the head table dimmed. Preston climbed 2 steps to a small stage, unhurried the way a man walks when the room already belongs to him. He tapped the microphone twice. The room went quiet in stages, table by table. Water finding its level. Even the kitchen doors behind me seemed to still some instinct in the staff, telling them not to swing them open until whatever was coming had come. I thought about the workshop back home. About a bell I'd cast 40 years ago that still hung in a church 3 counties over, still rang true after 4 decades of Sunday mornings, because I'd taken the time to listen for the flaw before I ever poured the metal. Preston Calloway had never learned to listen for anything. He only knew how to talk. He found me first. Table 9 by the kitchen doors. "Family," he said, "is a strange thing to inherit." He opened the folder. By the time my son's hand closed around that microphone, 400 people had already decided what kind of man I was. What none of them understood yet was what kind of man had raised him. Preston lifted the first page out of the folder, like a lawyer presenting Exhibit A. "I want to say something about family," he said, "because tonight my daughter is marrying into one." He let that sit a beat. "And I believe in honesty. I believe a family should know exactly what it's gaining." He read from the page. Cornelius Ashworth, 68, self-employed, annual reported income $11,000. He looked up, scanning the crowd like a man checking whether the joke had landed yet. 11,000. I spend more than that on this flower arrangement. A ripple of laughter, uncertain testing whether it was allowed. It was allowed. Preston smiled wider. Bank balance as of last month, $5,812. He said the number slow like he was savoring it. "We had our people look. 3 weeks of digging, and this is the best my son found for a father-in-law." He held the file up higher, angled toward the room, like a magician revealing there was never a rabbit in the hat at all. "A church bell repairman. Worth less than the wine on this table." The laughter came harder that time. Louder. It found its permission and didn't look back. I sat still. A man learns over enough years that stillness is its own kind of answer. I've been called worse things by men with less standing to say them. I've buried a wife in a suit I couldn't afford to replace, and stood over the grave without flinching because flinching costs you something you can't get back, in front of people waiting for you to break. There was a sound in that laughter I recognized from further back than that ballroom. My grandfather had heard something close to it once, standing in a lawyer's office in 1951, being told to sign his name to a piece of paper that called itself a sale. He hadn't flinched either. He'd folded his hat in his hands and signed, because the alternative wasn't a choice at all, and I'd spent 40 years making sure I would never again be a man with no alternative in the room. I didn't tell any of that to the 400 people laughing at my bank balance. Some things aren't for rooms like that. They're for keeping. But I wasn't the only one in that room. I watched my son's face from across the tables. He wasn't laughing. His jaw had gone tight the way mine does, right before I test a bell for a hairline crack. That stillness that isn't calm, it's pressure with nowhere left to go. Preston wasn't finished. He never is, once a room is laughing with him. Now, I don't say this to embarrass anyone. He said it the way men say that right before they do exactly that. I say it because I think it's beautiful, honestly. My daughter could have married anyone, old families, real money, and she chose a boy whose father can't afford the tablecloth he's sitting under. He set the folder down on the podium and rested both hands on it, the posture of a man delivering a benediction. That's grace, if you ask me. That's what this family is built on. Someone near the front applauded 2 claps before realizing no one else had joined them. A few tables over, I caught sight of the waiter who'd refilled my water, standing near the kitchen doors, now tray forgotten at his side, watching the stage with an expression I recognized because I'd worn it myself 1,000 times. The face of a man counting the cost of saying something he can't afford to say. Preston looked back toward table 9. Toward me. And he said the thing that I understood even then he'd been saving for exactly this moment. Not spontaneous, not a slip, but a line he'd written down somewhere and practiced. Cornelius, stand up. Let everyone see the man who raised such a generous boy. I did not stand up. 400 faces turned to find me instead, table 9 by the kitchen doors, and I felt the particular weight of being looked at by people who have already decided what they're looking at. I've stood in worse spotlights than that one. I kept my hands flat on the table and let them look. The silence after that request stretched half a second longer than comfortable, and in that half second, I watched something happen to my son that I will remember for the rest of my life. I watched 29 years of him swallowing things for other people's comfort come due all at once. Marcus stood up instead. He didn't storm the stage. He didn't shout. He walked the same unhurried walk I'd taught him without ever meaning to teach it. The walk of a man who's already decided something and doesn't need to convince anyone of it along the way. Preston, still smiling, must have thought his new son-in-law was coming up to laugh along, to be a good sport, to prove the family had a sense of humor about itself. Marcus reached the stage. Preston extended the microphone toward him, still grinning, already composing the story he'd tell about this moment at future dinner parties, the night the groom joined in on the joke. Marcus tore it out of his hand. He didn't ease it away. He wrenched it hard enough that the cable snapped taut, and the stand rocked on its base, and the speakers screamed with feedback, a long, jagged shriek that tore through the room and made 400 people flinch at once. Glasses halting halfway to lips, a woman near the front pressing both hands over her ears. Marcus's thumb found the power switch and killed it. Then silence. Not quiet. Silence, the specific total kind that happens when a room full of noise remembers all at once that it's being watched. Somewhere near the bar, ice settled in a glass with a small, distinct click. A chair leg scraped against the floor and stopped whoever moved it, thinking better of finishing the motion. The spotlight above the stage hummed faintly, the only sound with permission to continue. I could hear my own pulse in my ears, slow and even, the way it gets right before I strike a mold to test whether the metal inside has set. Preston's hand was still half raised where the microphone had been. The room didn't hear the words. I did. I was close enough, and I've spent my whole life reading things other people miss. Say it again, Marcus told him. Say it again, but look at him this time instead of the room. Preston's smile faltered. Not gone, just adjusting, recalculating. The expression of a man who has never once in his life been told no by someone standing this close to him. Somewhere behind them a phone flashed. Then another. The room, sensing something had shifted, but not yet understanding what, began to lean forward the way water leans toward a drain. I set down my fork. I folded my napkin the way you do at the end of a meal, though the meal was far from over. Marcus clicked the microphone back on. The red light returned. 400 people heard it hum to life. That small electric sound, that means whatever comes next will not be private. Marcus held the microphone the way a man holds something he's decided he's willing to break. You spent 3 weeks digging through my father's bank account, he said. His voice carried now flat and even, filling every corner of a room that had gone dead quiet. 3 weeks. A whole team. And you found $11,000 and a bell repair shop, and you decided that told you everything you needed to know about him. Preston recovered fast, I'll give him that. He straightened his jacket, found something close to his stage smile again. Marcus, we're all having a little fun tonight. Nobody meant... I'm not finished. The 2 words landed harder than anything Preston had said all night. Because Preston was used to filling silences, and Marcus had just taken that away from him too. You stood up here and read his bank balance to 400 people like it was a verdict. You called him trash without using the word, which somehow made it worse because at least trash is honest about what it is. Marcus turned slow, taking in the tables, the frozen faces, the phones still angled up at the stage. Every single one of you laughed. I watched you do it. I'm going to remember which tables laughed the loudest. A woman near the front lowered her champagne glass without drinking from it. Preston's jaw tightened. This is not the time or place. You picked the time and place, Marcus said. You picked it 3 weeks ago when you decided to put his tax return on a projector screen in your head before you'd even shaken his hand. He looked at the folder still sitting on the podium. You don't know a single thing about that man. You know numbers. That's not the same as knowing someone, Preston, whatever your due diligence report told you. I watched Preston's eyes flick just once toward the back of the room. Toward Grant. I'd learn later, though I didn't know his face yet. A man checking whether his expert witness had heard himself being called out. Marcus turned toward the head table. Toward Vanessa. She was standing exactly where she'd been standing when the microphone first screamed, both hands loosely folded in front of her ivory dress. Watching her new husband the way you'd watch a car accident you weren't sure yet whether to run toward. Vanessa. Marcus said her name into the microphone, and it came out gentler than anything else he'd said, which somehow made it worse, because you could hear how much he wanted her to give him a reason to keep loving the last 20 minutes of his life. Say something, anything. Tell them that's not funny. Tell your father he's wrong. You don't even have to defend my father. Just don't let this stand. The room waited with him. I watched her mouth open. I watched it close again. She looked at her father, one quick, involuntary glance, the kind you can't train out of a person who spent 30 years learning where the real authority in a room sits. And something in that glance answered the question before she ever spoke a word. Beside her, I noticed Camille lean in and whisper something short into her sister's ear. I couldn't hear it. I didn't need to. Whatever it was, Vanessa's spine straightened a half-inch, the posture of a woman being reminded which side of a room she belonged to. Marcus, she said finally, and her voice barely reached the second row of tables, let alone the back. Can we not do this here? That was all. 4 words and a request to move the humiliation somewhere more private, as if the problem had ever been the location. I have seen a lot of things break in my life. Bells mostly. The kind of breaking that happens slow, invisible, a hairline fracture widening under decades of Sunday mornings, until one day the note comes out wrong and you finally understand the damage was done years before you heard it. I watched my son break the other way, fast, all at once, right there on a stage in front of 400 people, holding up their phones. That's it, he asked her. Not into the microphone anymore, just to her. She didn't answer that either. Marcus turned back to the room, and when he lifted the microphone again, his voice had changed, steadier, colder. A register I hadn't heard from him since he was 19 years old, and told me he wasn't going to let a man at his summer job talk to him the way that man had been talking to him. "This wedding is on hold," he said. "It doesn't continue until Preston Calloway apologizes to my father, not to me. To him. In front of every one of you, since every one of you was invited to watch him get insulted." A murmur went through the room, the particular sound 400 people make when they realize they might not be going home on schedule. Preston laughed. It wasn't a big laugh. It was worse than that short, dry, almost bored the laugh of a man who has never once believed a threat pointed at him could actually cost him anything. "You want me to apologize," he said, "for telling the truth. I want you to apologize for using it as a weapon. There's no difference, son." He said the word son the way he'd say a brand name he didn't respect. The truth is the truth whether or not it's comfortable. Your father's finances are what they are. I didn't invent the number in his checking account. I just read it out loud. He picked the folder back up off the podium, almost casual now, a man reclaiming ground. "If the two of you are embarrassed by where he stands, that's not a problem I created. That's a problem you married into. He raised me." Marcus said, "You just paid for the flowers." Something in the crowd made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, a release, a few people finding permission to feel the thing they'd been suppressing since the folder first opened. Preston's face went the particular shade of red I would come to recognize over the following weeks as the color of a man discovering that money doesn't purchase the specific kind of silence he was counting on. "I'm not apologizing to a bell repairman," he said loud enough now that the microphone barely mattered. "In front of the mayor's wife and 2 state senators, because my son-in-law has stage fright about his own upbringing. Sit down, Marcus. Finish your dinner. We'll discuss this like adults tomorrow, in private, like civilized people." "We're discussing it now." "No," Preston said, and for the first time that night, something underneath the polish showed itself. Not anger, exactly, something closer to disbelief, that this was even a conversation, happening in his own rented ballroom. "We are not." He set the folder down. He straightened his cuffs. And he looked out at the room the way a man looks when he's decided a subject is closed, whether or not the other party agrees. Somewhere near the back, a caterer had frozen mid-step with a tray of champagne flutes, unsure whether serving drinks into a standoff counted as bad timing or exactly the right timing. Nobody reached for a glass. The band tucked off to the side had stopped tuning between songs and gone completely still, instruments lowered, watching the stage like the rest of us. The silence that followed wasn't the kind from before. It had a different weight to it, 400 people no longer watching a joke land, but watching to see which of the 2 men standing on that stage was actually in charge of what happened next. Marcus looked at Preston for a long moment. Then he looked past him out at the room and finally back to me. Table 9 by the kitchen doors, the way a man looks for a compass before he decides which direction the rest of his life is going to point. I didn't wait for him to cross the room. I stood up from table 9, buttoned my jacket and walked toward the exit, and I felt 400 pairs of eyes follow me the whole way. Not laughing anymore. Just watching the way people watch weather they can't predict. A valet in a red vest offered to bring my truck around, and then looked embarrassed when he realized I'd walked, not driven, having parked 3 blocks over where the lot didn't charge by the hour. Marcus caught up with me at the coat check, still in his tuxedo jacket tie loosened to nothing, and neither of us said a word until we were outside. It had started raining sometime during dinner. The kind of steady, low-country rain that doesn't announce itself. Just arrives and settles in. We stood under the awning of the Buford Exchange Hall, while a line of luxury cars idled at the curb, waiting on guests who weren't leaving yet, their headlights smearing gold across the wet cobblestones. Somewhere behind us, through the glass doors, I could still make out the shape of the band starting up again. Not the reception. Not anymore. Just the sound of a room trying to remember how to be a party. "Say something," Marcus said. "What would you like me to say?" "Anything. React. You just sat there and let him—" He stopped, pressed the heel of his hand against one eye, breathing hard through his nose. 68 years old and you let a man half your age call you trash in front of the mayor's wife and you didn't even blink. I heard him. You didn't do anything. I let you do something, I said. That was the plan. He looked at me like I'd slapped him. There was a plan. I didn't answer that the way I should have. I've spent so long deciding what not to say that sometimes the silence comes out of me before I can catch it, even when silence is the last thing a moment needs. Marcus turned away from me, out toward the rain, jaw working the way it had on that stage an hour before. "You've lived like this my whole life," he said, quieter now, which somehow cut deeper than shouting would have. "Working shifts nobody wanted, driving that truck with the door that doesn't latch right, buying groceries with coupons you clip out of the Sunday paper like it's still 1990. And I never once questioned it because you told me that's just who we are. Hardworking people, honest people, people who don't have much but don't need much." He turned back to face me. Was any of that true? Or was I just the one person you never bothered lying to directly? "It was true," I said. "Every bit of it was true. I have worked every day of my life. I have been honest with everyone I've ever done business with." I let that sit a second. I never said it was the whole truth. Then what is the whole truth, Pop? Because I just watched a room full of strangers agree you're worth less than a bottle of wine. And the man standing next to me, who's supposed to know better than anyone alive, didn't say a word to correct them. Somewhere in his jacket pocket, I knew, sat a small disc of copper I'd cast for him when he was 10 years old. A scrap piece from a bell mold, cooled and smoothed and given to him on a Tuesday for no occasion at all. Because I'd wanted him to have something from my hands that wasn't a chore or a lecture. He still carried it. I'd seen him rub his thumb over it during exams, during his mother's funeral, during the drive to his first day at the engineering firm. He wasn't touching it now. His hands were jammed in his pockets, fists closed around nothing. I had a coin of my own in a manner of speaking, though mine wasn't copper. Mine was a fracture. A bell mold my grandfather had cracked clean through the year he lost his land. Kept ever since in a drawer in my workshop, never repaired, never thrown away. I'd looked at it more times than I could count over 40 years and told myself the crack was a reminder. Tonight, standing in the rain with my son, looking at me like a stranger, I understood for the first time that it might have been something closer to a hiding place. I knew standing there that I had done exactly what my grandfather did. Folded my hat and kept my silence, told myself it was strength when it was really just the shape fear takes when it's had 40 years to practice. I didn't say that to Marcus. Some confessions you don't get to make standing in a rainstorm outside your son's ruined wedding. You have to earn the right to say them somewhere quieter. My phone rang before I had to find an answer that wouldn't have been good enough anyway. I stepped a few feet under the overhang out of the worst of the rain and answered. Desmond's voice came through low and fast, none of his usual patience in it. "Cornelius, I got a call an hour ago from a contact at the county clerk's office. Somebody pulled the full parcel history on your workshop lot this afternoon. Plat maps, easements, chain of title going back to the original grant. Who? Request came through a law firm that does contract work for Callaway Holdings. Might be nothing. Due diligence people run title searches on neighboring properties all the time when they're planning an expansion." A pause, paper shuffling somewhere on his end. "Might also be something. I don't like the timing. Same week as the wedding, same firm that vetted you 3 weeks ago. Keep watching it." "I always do." A beat softer now. "How'd the wedding go?" "About how you'd expect." Another pause. Longer this time, the kind Desmond only allowed himself with people he'd known longer than he'd known most of his own family. "You want me to start moving anything tonight?" "Not tonight," I said. "Tonight, I'm just listening." I hung up. Marcus was watching me from a few feet away, rain darkening the shoulders of his suit, water running off the edge of his jaw. "Who was that?" "Desmond. The lawyer you mentioned exactly once 6 years ago and never again." "That's him." "What did he want?" I looked at my son standing in the rain outside a wedding that had just ended before it started. And I thought about the drawer in my workshop where I'd kept a cracked bell mold for 4 decades because I couldn't decide whether it was a warning or an excuse. I thought about the copper disc in his pocket he wasn't touching. I thought about a lawyer's office in 1951 and a man who folded his hat because the alternative wasn't a choice. I'd been telling myself for 40 years that the day would come when I was ready. I understood, standing in that rain, that readiness was never going to arrive on its own. Sometimes a man has to choose the day or the day chooses him, standing in a suit he can't afford outside a hall that used to belong to his grandfather. "Get in the truck," I said. "We're not going home to sit with this. We're going to the shop." "Pop, it's nearly midnight. Whatever this is, can it wait until—" "No," I said, and something in my voice made him stop arguing. The same something that used to make him stop arguing when he was 8 years old, and I told him not to touch the kiln. "It's waited 40 years already. I'm done making it wait." He looked at me a long moment in the rainwater running between us, and then he walked to the truck without another word. The workshop smelled the way it had smelled my entire adult life. Hot metal gone cold, beeswax, the particular dust that settles into a place where men have been shaping bronze for 3 generations. Marcus had grown up half in this building, sweeping floors for allowance money, and he moved through it now the way you move through a room you think you already know completely. I walked past the casting floor, past the row of half-finished molds waiting on commissions from 3 different churches, to the tall storage rack where I kept templates going back to my grandfather's time, wooden forms, iron patterns, the accumulated tools of a trade most people assume died out with the last century. I reached behind the 3rd shelf and pressed my palm flat against a panel of wood that looked to anyone who hadn't spent 40 years knowing better, exactly like the wall behind it. "Pop, what are you doing?" I didn't answer. A soft mechanical hum answered for me, and the rack swung outward on hinges too well oiled to have been installed by any contractor Marcus would recognize. Behind it was a door. Steel reinforced nothing like the wood it hid behind. I typed a code into a keypad set flush into the frame, and it released with a sound like a held breath finally let go. "Dad." Marcus's voice had gone quiet in a way I hadn't heard from him since he was a boy afraid of something under the bed. "What is this?" "Something I should have shown you a long time ago." We went down a narrow staircase, concrete steps. The temperature dropping with each one, the air turning clean and filtered in a way that had nothing to do with a 100-year-old bell foundry sitting above us. At the bottom, the space opened into a room that belonged in a different building entirely. Server racks humming along one wall, a bank of monitors glowing soft blue over a glass desk, maps of shipping routes and property holdings pinned to a corkboard along the far wall. I understood watching my son take it in the first time. In his 32 years, he'd seen a version of me that didn't smell like a foundry. A man was already sitting at the desk. He rose when he heard us on the stairs, unhurried, a suit that fit him the way suits fit men who'd stopped needing anyone's approval decades ago. Bald broad through the shoulders, eyes that took in Marcus and finished assessing him before Marcus had finished descending the last step. "You're later than I expected," the man said to me. Then to Marcus with a small, formal nod. "Desmond Okafor." Marcus looked at him, then at the monitors, then back at me. "You said Desmond on the phone. You didn't say be in your basement." "It's not a basement," I said. "It's the real headquarters of Battery Point Holdings. Has been for 31 years. I've known your father since I was 26 years old, and about to lose the only law practice my own father ever built," Desmond said before Marcus could ask. "He bought the note on our office building the week the bank was set to foreclose, and he never once mentioned it to me directly. I found out from the county clerk 6 years later entirely by accident." He said it without warmth, the way a man states a fact he's long since stopped being surprised by. "I've worked for no one else since." Marcus laughed, one short, disbelieving sound. The kind a man makes when his body hasn't caught up to what his ears just heard. "Battery Point Holdings. That's a company? You own a company?" "I own several," I said. "Battery Point is the one that matters tonight." Desmond tapped a key on the console in front of him, and one of the monitors filled with a document scanned the paper, yellowed with age, even in digital form. A deed. My grandfather's name at the bottom, alongside a signature that wasn't his, forcing a transfer of 80 acres of land for a sum so small it looked even now like a typo. "Sit down, son," I said. He didn't sit. He stood in front of that screen, reading it twice the way you read something you're hoping will change if you look at it long enough. "That's your grandfather's name," he said finally. "That's my grandfather's land." Or it was, until 1951. When the county reassessed the parcel, under an emergency ordinance nobody bothered explaining to him, and a man named Elias Calloway bought it at auction for less money than this suit cost. I let that settle. Preston's great-grandfather. Marcus's hand found the edge of the desk, gripping it the way a man grips something when the floor has stopped being reliable. The Calloways. Tonight's Calloways. The same family. And you've known this the whole time. My whole life. You knew whose family I was marrying into. I knew the moment Vanessa's name came up at dinner 2 years ago. I said. I let it happen anyway because I wanted to see what kind of woman she was before I decided what kind of family I was dealing with. I got my answer tonight, same as you did. Marcus turned away from the screen, pacing now, 3 steps one way and 3 steps back in the small space between the desk and the server racks. This is insane. This is Dad, none of this makes any sense. You fix bells. You drive a truck that doesn't start half the time in the rain. You count coupons. I do all of those things, I said. I've done them every day of my life and I'll keep doing most of them. Because a man needs work that uses his hands or he starts believing his own reflection too much. I nodded toward Desmond and he pulled up a second screen, this one alive, moving numbers, scrolling in real time. But I also own the debt on 4 buildings in downtown Beaufort. I hold a controlling interest in a logistics firm that services half the ports between here and Savannah. And through Battery Point, I have spent 31 years quietly buying back every piece of paper connected to the land your great-great-grandfather lost in 1951. Marcus stopped pacing. The room went very still. Not the polished silence of the ballroom an hour before, but something raw, unfinished. The kind of quiet a house holds right after a piece of furniture falls and before anyone moves to check the damage. Desmond didn't fill it. I didn't either. Somewhere behind the server racks, a cooling fan clicked, on its low hum the only sound in the room for what felt like a very long time. The blue light from the monitors sat flat and unmoving across Marcus's face, and he didn't blink. Didn't reach for the desk again, didn't do anything at all except stand there, letting the fact finish landing. "Why?" he finally said, and his voice had lost all its earlier heat. Gone flat and small in a way that worried me more than the shouting had. "Would you sit at that table tonight, in that suit, and let them call you trash, when you could have stood up and ended it in one sentence?" "Because ending it in one sentence isn't the same as ending it right," I said. "A man who reveals himself out of anger hands his enemy the story. I've spent 31 years making sure that when this finally came out, it would come out on my terms, in my time, in a way they couldn't spin into something smaller than it is." I reached into my jacket and set something on the desk between us. A small, cracked bronze disc, half a bell mold split clean through, tarnished, dark with age. "This belonged to your great-grandfather. He kept it after they took the land. I don't know if it was a reminder or a wound he couldn't stop touching. I've kept it the same way for the same reason, without ever being honest with myself about which one it was." Marcus looked down at it. He didn't touch it. "So what happens now?" he asked. "Now," I said, "you're going to understand why I let you cry in a rented parking lot for an hour tonight instead of telling you sooner. And then you're going to help me finish what my grandfather never got the chance to." "Finish what?" Marcus said. "Finish what exactly? You're going to tell me a story about a deed from 1951 and then what? Call a lawyer tomorrow and take it all back? Is that the plan? Is that what you and Desmond have been doing down here for 31 years, waiting for the right moment?" "Sit down," I said again, and this time he did, dropping into the chair across from Desmond's desk like his legs had finally run out of argument. "I'll tell you the whole thing, all of it. And then you can decide if you still want to be angry with me, or if you understand. Desmond pulled up another file without being asked. A photograph, this one, black and white. A man in a collared shirt standing in front of a wood-frame house with a porch that leaned the same direction mine did now, 80 years later. "That's your great-grandfather," I said. "Isaiah Ashworth, my father's father. He owned 80 acres along the Coosaw River, cleared it himself after the war, grew tobacco and later soybeans, built that house with his own hands, the year my father was born." I let Marcus look at the photograph a moment. In the spring of 1951, the county reassessed a stretch of riverfront land for what they called a flood mitigation project. Isaiah's parcel sat right in the middle of it. The reassessment tripled his property taxes overnight. Taxes he had no way to pay on a subsistence farm. And no bank in 3 counties would lend a black landowner the money to cover them. Not because he wasn't creditworthy, because of what he was. "So they took it," Marcus said quietly. "They didn't take it. That's the part that still makes my jaw tight 50 years later. They offered him a way to keep it, sell the parcel at a price the county's own appointed assessor called fair, or lose it entirely to a tax auction where he'd get nothing at all. Elias Calloway's company made the offer. Isaiah signed. Everyone at the courthouse called it a voluntary transaction. There's a signature on that deed and a notary stamp and everything a lawyer needs to call a sale legal." I nodded at the screen. It was legal. It was also a robbery with better paperwork than most robberies get. Desmond pulled the next page up without being asked, a scan of the original tax assessment. The numbers circled twice in someone's careful, aging handwriting. "I've read this file more times than I can count," he said. The reassessment singled out 4 parcels along that stretch of river. 3 belonged to white farmers. Those 3 were quietly adjusted back down within a year once the flood project stalled and never actually broke ground. Isaiah's parcel was the only one that stayed reassessed. Nobody ever explained why. "Nobody had to explain why," I said. "That was the whole point." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "What happened to him? To Isaiah?" "He worked the rest of his life as a hired hand on land he used to own. Died at 61, my father says, of what the doctor called a heart condition, and what everyone in the family always understood to mean something closer to a broken one." I looked at the photograph a beat longer than I meant to. My father never got over it. He wasn't the kind of man who could turn grief into anything useful. He just carried it, and it wore him down early too. I remember him standing at the edge of that same river when I was a boy, pointing across it at land that wasn't ours anymore, telling me the names of crops his father used to grow there, like he was reciting a prayer he couldn't stop saying. I was 12 when I decided I wasn't going to carry it the same way he did. "So you started buying things back?" "Not right away. I didn't have $2 to rub together at 12. But I started paying attention to land, to money, to how the people who'd taken everything from my family thought about the world. I learned bell casting from a man in Charleston who also, it turned out, understood how to read a balance sheet better than most bankers I've since met. I started small. A parcel here, a lien there, always through Battery Point, never under my own name, because the moment my name touched any of it, the story would become about me instead of about what happened to Isaiah. "Cornelius has been methodical in a way I rarely see," Desmond said, the first time he'd volunteered anything unprompted. "Most men who come into money this way want to spend it proving something. Your father spent 31 years proving nothing to anyone. He just kept buying, kept waiting, kept quiet. I've handled his paperwork longer than I handled my own father's estate, and I can count on one hand the number of times he's raised his voice about any of it." "Why?" Marcus said, and there it was, the question underneath every other question he'd asked me since we walked into this room. "Why wait 40 years? If you had the money, if you had the legal standing, why not just take it all back the moment you were able to? Why let Preston Calloway humiliate you at my wedding instead of ending this years ago?" I didn't answer that right away. It's a fair question, and it deserved better than a quick one. "Because taking something back with money alone isn't the same as taking it back with justice," I said finally. If I'd shown up 30 years ago and bought the Callaways out of everything they owned, I'd have been just another rich man moving pieces on a board. Nobody would have understood why. Nobody would have had to. I wanted it to mean something when it finally happened, not just for me, but for every family that lost what Isaiah lost and never had a way to get it back. That takes patience I'm not sure most men have. It cost me things, too. I looked at him directly. It cost me 40 years of not being fully honest with the one person I love more than anyone alive. Marcus's jaw worked, but the anger in it had shifted into something quieter, something closer to grief. You could have told me. Not the world, just me. I know, I said. I've known that for longer than you'd believe. I kept telling myself I was protecting you, that the less you knew, the safer you'd be, the more normal a life you could live. But I think if I'm honest with you the way I should have been years ago, I was protecting myself. As long as I never said it out loud, I never had to be the man who took it back. I could stay the man who was still deciding. The cooling fans hummed. Desmond had gone still at his desk, giving us the room the way a good lawyer learns to give clients room for the parts that aren't legal matters at all. So what changed? Marcus asked. Why tonight? I thought about the ballroom. The folder. The word trash dressed up as honesty delivered with a smile in front of 400 people, who laughed because laughing cost them nothing. Because I watched a Callaway do to you what a Callaway did to my grandfather, I said. Different room, different century, same contempt, dressed in better clothes. And I understood standing at that table that if I let this moment pass the way I'd let every other moment pass for 40 years, I wasn't protecting anyone anymore. I was just still folding my hat. Marcus looked down at the cracked bronze disc still sitting on the desk between us. This time he picked it up. Okay, he said, turning it over once in his palm. Tell me what happens next. I wasn't in that room. I want to be honest about that, the same way I've decided to be honest about everything else from here forward. What happened in Preston Callaway's office 2 days after the wedding, I learned the way I learned most things about the Callaways over the following weeks. Because Desmond has contacts who file paperwork, because a camera in a lobby catches more than people realize, and because eventually one of the people in that room told me himself, though that part comes later. Preston's office sat on the top floor of a glass building downtown, the kind with a view expensive enough that nobody who worked there ever had to look at it twice. His desk faced the harbor, positioned I'd later understand so that any visitor sitting across from him had no choice but to see both the man and the skyline he liked to imply he owned a piece of. 2 days after his daughter's wedding fell apart in front of 400 witnesses, he sat behind that desk and listened to his real estate attorney explain, in the careful voice lawyers use when they know their client won't like the answer, that the county records showed an unresolved lien clouding title on a parcel adjacent to the Kensington, the Callaway Exchange Hall. Unresolved how? Preston said. It's old, filed decades ago, tied to a mortgage that should have been satisfied and released, except the release was never properly recorded. The attorney slid a printout across the desk. It doesn't block your current ownership, but it complicates the title work for the expansion. Any lender financing new construction is going to want it cleared before they release funds. Then clear it. We're trying. The lien holder of record is a holding company. We've sent letters, no response yet. What's the company called? The attorney checked his notes. Battery Point Holdings. Preston didn't react to the name the way he would have if he'd known what it meant. Why would he? It was to him 4 words on a printout, the kind of shell entity that clutters half the deed records in the county, usually abandoned, usually irrelevant, usually just a formality some paralegal clears up in an afternoon with a phone call and a $50 filing fee. Handle it, Preston said, already moving on to the next item on his morning, which was, according to the version of this story I eventually pieced together, a much longer conversation with his event planner about whether the launch gala for the Exchange Hall expansion should serve a signature cocktail or stick with an open bar. Camille came by his office around lunch. She did that most days, not out of any particular closeness I'd learn, but because Preston liked having at least one daughter he could still be certain of. and Vanessa's certainty had taken a visible hit 2 nights before. Camille mentioned in the loose, unweighted way people mention things that don't seem to matter yet that Grant had come home the night before, distracted, going through old parcel records for a case he wouldn't fully explain. He kept saying some name, she told her father, more amused than curious. Battery Point something. Kept muttering it like it meant something. I told him he needs a vacation. Preston looked up from the papers on his desk. Say that again? Grant. He's been running background on some old land records. I don't know, something for a client, probably. He mentioned a name. Battery Point. The attorney, still standing near the desk, finishing his notes on the lien, went very still. Preston's face did something Camille would describe to me much later as the particular stillness of a man doing arithmetic he doesn't like the result of. Get Grant on the phone, Preston said. Now. Grant arrived within the hour, the way a man arrives when his father-in-law's assistant uses the word now in a voicemail. He stood in the doorway of Preston's office with the careful posture of someone who has learned, over years of marriage into this family, that being summoned rarely meant being praised. You've been looking into a company called Battery Point Holdings, Preston said. Not a question. Not exactly. I was running a supplemental background check following up on something from the wedding investigation. A due diligence loose end. The name came up attached to a chain of old land transactions near the river. I didn't think it was connected to anything urgent. It's attached to my building, Preston said. There's a lien on the parcel next to the exchange hall, and it's held by a company with the exact name you were muttering to my daughter last night. He came around the desk closer than Grant looked comfortable with. I don't believe in coincidences that convenient, Grant. Find out who's behind that company. Today. Not next week. Today. It could take some time to pierce a holding structure like that. I don't care how long it takes you to explain why it's difficult. I care how long it takes you to have an answer. Preston walked to the window, looking out over a city he'd spent 30 years believing belonged to him, more than it belonged to anyone else. And while you're at it, I want the Ashworth situation resolved before the gala. That shack sits on the edge of my property line. I want it gone. I want the lot cleared and paved before a single reporter sets foot on my site. Sir, the wedding is exactly why I want it handled fast, Preston said, not turning around. That old man humiliated my family in front of the mayor's wife. I'm not interested in patience right now. I want him gone. I want that lien cleared, and I want this Battery Point nonsense to turn out to be nothing, because if it's not nothing, Grant, I'm going to want to know why the man I pay to protect this family's interests didn't find it 3 weeks ago when it mattered. Grant left the office with his jaw tight and his phone already in his hand. He went that same afternoon to the county records office, the same building where clerks pull deeds for anyone willing to pay the copy fee, the same public record that had sat there unremarked for 75 years. He requested the full parcel history for the land bordering Preston's expansion site, going back as far as the county's digitized files allowed. The clerk handed him a folder an hour later. Grant sat at a long table under fluorescent lights that hummed the way fluorescent lights always hum in rooms where nobody wants to be, and began paging through documents that hadn't been touched by anyone outside a title company in decades. He was thorough about it. That was the thing about Grant. The thing that had made him useful to Preston in the first place. He didn't skim. He read footnotes. He cross-referenced parcel numbers against a county map app on his phone, tracing boundary lines with his finger, the way a man traces something he doesn't fully trust yet. Halfway through the stack, he found a name he didn't recognize attached to a deed he did. Isaiah Ashworth. He sat with that for a moment, not yet understanding what he was looking at, only understanding the way a man understands a sound in his own house at night before he understands its source. That something about it didn't sit right. He pulled out his notebook, the leather one he carried everywhere, and wrote the name down beneath a column of dates, underlining it twice before he even knew why it deserved underlining. The call came on a Thursday evening 4 days after the wedding, while Marcus and I were in the workshop going over the shape of what Desmond called, with more patience than the situation probably deserved, Phase 1. The rain that had followed us home from the wedding had finally broken that morning, and the workshop windows stood open for the first time in a week, letting in the smell of wet pine from the yard outside. Marcus had taken to coming by most evenings now, after his shifts at the engineering firm, sitting on an overturned bucket near the casting floor. While Desmond walked us through documents neither of us had the legal training to fully follow on our own. I answered on the second ring because I recognized the number Desmond had flagged for me 2 days earlier. A burner Preston had started using once he'd realized his usual line might not be as private as he liked to think. Lester. He'd taken to calling me that, a name he'd apparently decided suited a man he'd already filed away as beneath remembering correctly. I let it go. There's a version of me that would have corrected him. That version wasn't useful yet. Mr. Calloway, I've been looking at survey maps of my expansion site, he said, no preamble, the voice of a man who considers pleasantries a tax he refuses to pay. Funny thing, your little workshop sits right on the edge of my property line. Practically inside it, depending which old map you trust. A pause, the particular pause of a man enjoying the sound of his own leverage. It's an eyesore, Lester. Ruins the view from what's going to be the finest tower in this city. It's my workshop, I said. My family's been on that land a long time. I'm sure it has. Look, I'm feeling generous. He said generous the way some men say a word they've never once meant. I'll buy it from you. Cash. Today even. Save you the trouble of watching me take it the harder way. What's the offer? $5,000. I let the silence sit there a beat, the way I would over any offer. Though the number itself didn't surprise me. $5,000 for a parcel and a building worth better than $500,000, even before you counted what sat beneath it. It was never meant to be a fair number. It was meant to be a number small enough to humiliate me on its own, the same way the folder at the wedding had been designed to humiliate before it ever informed. That's not a serious offer, I said, carefully to let a tremor into my voice. The specific, unsteady note of an old man who's just been told the ground under him is smaller than he thought. It's the only offer you're going to get, Preston said, warmth draining fast now, the mask he wore for donors and senators sliding off in real time. Here's what happens if you say no, Lester. I have lunch with the zoning commissioner every second Tuesday. I know 2 men on the county building inspection board personally. It would not take much effort at all for someone to discover your little shop has code violations nobody's bothered to enforce in 40 years. Wiring, foundation, fire safety, take your pick. I could have that place condemned inside of a month. You'd get nothing, not 5,000, nothing. He let that land. So take the money. Buy yourself a bus ticket somewhere warm, or don't and watch a bulldozer take it from you for free. Marcus, sitting across the workshop with his arms crossed, had gone rigid the moment he understood what the call was. He mouthed a word at me I won't repeat here, and I held up one hand palm flat. The same gesture I'd used on him his whole life to mean, not yet. He'd been quiet through most of the call, but I watched his knuckles go pale where his fingers gripped his own forearms, and I understood he was doing the same arithmetic I was, measuring how much of himself it was going to cost to sit still while a man threatened his father, and finding, apparently, that the cost was steep. You'd really do that? I said into the phone, letting my voice crack somewhere in the middle of it. Over a piece of land. I'd do a great deal more than that, Lester, if it means my tower opens on schedule, with a clean view and no eyesore sitting on the edge of it. A beat. You have 24 hours. I'll have a courier bring the paperwork tomorrow afternoon. Sign it, take the 5,000 and disappear quietly. It's a better deal than you deserve, frankly, given what your son did to my daughter's wedding. He hung up before I could answer the particular rudeness of a man who's never once worried about being the one left holding a dead line. I set the phone down on the workbench. You're not seriously thinking about this, Marcus said, already moving toward me. Dad, tell me you're not thinking about selling him the land for $5,000? I'm thinking about it very seriously, I said. He's trying to steal it from you the same way his family stole it from Isaiah. You're going to hand it to him. I'm going to sell it to him, I said. There's a difference, and it's the only difference that's ever mattered in any of this. I picked up the phone again and dialed Desmond, who answered on the first ring, already half expecting the call. He made his offer. 5,000. 24 hours. He's sending a courier with paperwork tomorrow. Good, Desmond said, no hesitation at all. The tone of a man who'd been waiting years to hear those exact words. Let him have it. Marcus stared at me like I'd started speaking a language he'd never learned. You're going to let him have it? After everything you just told me? After Isaiah? I need you to draft an addendum, I told Desmond, ignoring my son for one more moment, because some conversations need to happen in a particular order, or they don't land right. A rider to the contract. He's arrogant and he's angry and he won't read past the signature line. He never has. I want a reversionary interest clause, standard language for high-risk transfers. If the buyer defaults on any related obligation, faces a judgment, or fails to develop the parcel within a set window, title reverts to the original owner. Automatically. No further action required. And improvements made to the land in the meantime? Desmond asked, already writing. Those revert too. Whatever he builds on it, however much he spends, it comes back to us the moment the clause triggers. It's done, Desmond said. I'll have it inserted into the packet before his courier ever leaves the printer. We still have people inside his firm who owe me favors, older than Marcus. I hung up and looked at my son, who had gone quiet in the particular way people go quiet when understanding arrives faster than they're prepared for it. He thinks he's buying land, I said. He's about to sign a contract that turns every dollar he spends improving it into a gift he's giving us for free. He wants to build something beautiful on the edge of my grandfather's land Marcus let him. We'll just be the ones who end up owning whatever he builds. Marcus sat down slowly on the edge of the workbench, some of the fight draining out of him, replaced by something closer to disbelief. You're dangerous. I'm patient, I said. Most people confuse the two. My phone buzzed once more. A text from Desmond, the draft already attached. Clause 14B, buried on page 15, beneath 3 pages of easement language. No drunk, arrogant man in a hurry to build a tower would ever bother reading twice. I texted back a single word. Send it. The courier arrived the following afternoon in a black sedan that looked out of place parked in front of my shop, engine idling like it was embarrassed to be there. A young man in a fitted suit stepped out, chewing gum, carrying a leather portfolio he handled like it weighed more than it did. Cornelius Ashworth, that's me. Sign at the tabs. He handed me the portfolio without ceremony. The posture of a man who delivers documents for a living and has stopped caring what any of them mean. Mr. Calloway said to tell you this is generous given the circumstances. I took the papers inside. Marcus stood by the kitchen table, arms crossed, watching me. The way you'd watch a man walk toward a ledge you weren't sure he understood was there, except by now he understood the ledge better than the courier ever would. I flipped through the contract slowly, the way an old man might, though I'd already seen the version Desmond had prepared. 14 pages, standard predatory language, the kind that transfers a deed for a token payment and dresses the whole transaction up in enough legal boilerplate that it photographs as a fair deal to anyone who never gets past page 3. I turned to page 15. There it was, exactly where Desmond had placed it. Clause 14B, the reversionary interest provision, buried beneath 2 paragraphs about utility easements and drainage rights, language so dense and dull that a man in a hurry would skim right past it. Especially a man who'd never once in his life imagined the person across the table might be smarter than the deal he thought he was offering. You don't have to sign it, Marcus said quietly. I do, I said. That's the whole point. I signed with my left hand, not my writing hand. Hasn't been for 68 years, but a small enough detail that it barely mattered to anyone but me. A shaky, unfamiliar signature, the kind that could belong to a man twice as scared as I was actually feeling. I handed the papers back to the courier, who barely glanced at them before sliding them back into his portfolio. Tell Mr. Calloway I'm sorry it came to this, I said, letting my voice catch on the word sorry. The courier shrugged, already walking back to his car. I just deliver 'em. I watched the sedan pull away down the gravel drive, taillights disappearing past the tree line, and I stood there a moment longer than the moment required. The rain had picked back up, soft this time, barely more than a mist. Somewhere behind me, the screen door creaked once and settled. A dog barked twice at a neighboring property, then went quiet. I could hear the low tick of the truck's engine cooling in the drive, metal contracting the way it does after a long day of sitting in the sun, and beneath that fainter, the sound of pine needles shifting in a wind too light to feel against my face. I didn't move. I didn't say anything. Marcus didn't either. We just stood there together on the porch, letting the ordinary sounds of an ordinary evening settle back over a piece of land that had just changed hands for the second time in 73 years. Marcus came to stand beside me on the porch, closer this time than he'd stood in days. "He thinks he just won," he said. "He did just win," I said. "For about 6 weeks he's going to believe that with his whole chest." I turned to look at my son. "That's the part you have to understand, Marcus, if you're going to be any use to me going forward. Men like Preston Calloway don't lose because someone outsmarts them in a single conversation. They lose because their own certainty becomes the trap. He's going to take that $5,000, feel clever about it, and go build something enormous and expensive on land he thinks he stole clean." I nodded toward the tree line, toward the lot that used to be mine, and would before long be mine again. Every dollar he spends clearing those trees, pouring that foundation, running power out to whatever he builds, every bit of it becomes an improvement to a parcel that reverts to us the instant he trips that clause. He's not buying land, son. He's renting it and paying us to develop it while he does. I'd learned that lesson the hard way decades ago, watching men far less careless than Preston lose entire fortunes because they'd never once considered that the person selling them something might understand the transaction better than they did. Pride is a slow poison in men who've never had to survive without it. It works the same way every time. It convinces a man he's owed the win before he's earned it, and by the time he understands otherwise, the paperwork has already decided the outcome for him. The silence that followed wasn't the tense kind. It was the kind that comes after understanding finally arrives, whole, in one piece, instead of leaking in through cracks the way it had all week. I watched something shift in my son's face. Not relief, exactly, something closer to the specific vertigo of realizing the man you've spent your whole life underestimating was playing a much longer game than you ever had the patience to imagine. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Neither did I. Above us, a hawk circled once over the tree line and drifted east unhurried, the way things move when nothing below them has any power to touch them. "When does the clause trigger?" he finally asked. "What has to happen?" "Any material default. A judgment against him. Any conduct that materially damages the reputation of the transaction or breaches standard community ethics. Desmond wrote that language himself years ago for exactly this kind of buyer." I looked at my son. A man like Preston Calloway doesn't stay clean for 6 weeks. It isn't in him. We just have to be patient enough to watch him prove it. Marcus exhaled long and slow, like he'd been holding part of it since the wedding. "You could have told me all of this a week ago," he said, but there wasn't much heat left in it now. More exhaustion than accusation. "Just laid it out, instead of watching me panic in a parking lot." "I could have," I said. "I'm not going to pretend that was the only way. But I needed to know you'd still stand next to me once you understood what kind of man you'd have to become to finish this. Not the boy who cried in the rain outside a wedding. The man who signs contracts he doesn't fully understand yet and trusts the reasons will hold." I put a hand on his shoulder the first time I'd touched him since we left the ballroom. "You stood next to me tonight. That tells me more than any conversation could have." He looked down at my hand on his shoulder, then back up at me. Something loosening behind his eyes that had been tight since the moment Preston opened that folder. "So what do we do now?" he asked. "While we wait for him to trip the wire, we keep building the case Desmond's been building for years, quietly, so it's ready the moment he gives us a reason to use it. And you learn the parts of this business you're going to need to understand, because I'm 68 years old, Marcus, and none of this was ever meant to end with just me." I looked out at the tree line one more time, at the land that would before long carry my grandfather's name again, in every way that mattered, even if the deed itself would keep saying something else for a little while longer. Now, I said, we get you a suit worth wearing to whatever he throws next. He's not done trying to humiliate us. Men like that never stop until the math finally catches up to them. We're going to make sure we're dressed properly when it does. Marcus told me about this meeting the same night it happened, sitting at my kitchen table, with both hands wrapped around a mug of coffee he never once drank. I'm telling it to you the way he told it to me, because I wasn't there, and because some things a father only gets secondhand, no matter how close he stands to his son. Vanessa texted him on a Tuesday 6 days after the wedding that wasn't. Can we talk? Just us. Not about anything except talking. Marcus stared at that message for the better part of an hour before he answered, he told me, turning his phone over on the counter, picking it back up, setting it down again. The particular indecision of a man who isn't sure whether curiosity or self-respect should win. He agreed to meet her at a coffee shop on the edge of downtown. The kind of place with mismatched chairs and a chalkboard menu, chosen deliberately, he suspected, because it was nowhere either of their families would think to look for them. She was already there when he arrived, sitting in the back corner, with her hands folded around a cup she also wasn't drinking, dressed plainer than he'd ever seen her. No jewelry, hair pulled back, simple. The studied absence of effort that sometimes takes more effort than the presence of it would have. "Thank you for coming," she said. "I almost didn't. I know." She turned her cup a quarter turn on the table, not looking at him yet. "I haven't slept right since the wedding. I want you to know that, even if it doesn't mean anything to you anymore." "It doesn't mean nothing," Marcus said. "It just doesn't mean what you probably want it to mean." She nodded, accepting that, and for a moment neither of them said anything. The silence stretching long enough that a barista called out an order for someone else entirely, and neither of them flinched. "I should have said something," she finally told him. "That night, when you looked at me and asked me to say something, anything, and I just stood there. I've replayed it every day since. I keep coming up with better versions of myself who said the right thing, and none of them are real because the real version just stood there and let my father humiliate your father in front of 400 people. Why didn't you?" She was quiet a long moment. "Because I've spent my whole life understanding exactly what happens to people in my family who contradict my father in public. It isn't dramatic. He doesn't yell. He just removes things. Slowly. Access approval, the sense that you still belong somewhere. I watched it happen to my mother for 30 years before she stopped even trying to have opinions of her own. I told myself I was different. I found out standing on that stage that I'm not as different as I wanted to believe." Marcus didn't say anything to that. Whatever sympathy it deserved, he wasn't ready yet to hand it over freely. And I understood that completely when he told me, because a man doesn't owe absolution to someone just because they've finally found the courage to describe their own cowardice accurately. "I didn't ask you here to get you back," Vanessa said, reading something in his silence. "I know that's not happening, and honestly, I don't think I deserve it to happen. I asked you here because I think you should know something, and I don't have anyone else I trust enough to tell." "Know what?" She glanced around the coffee shop, an instinctive, practiced check before she lowered her voice. "My father is in trouble. Real trouble, not the kind he complains about at dinner. He's been moving money around for months, taking out loans against the company to cover what I think are crypto losses, though he'd never say that word out loud in front of me. The exchange hall expansion, the whole tower project, he needs it to succeed publicly, fast, because I think privately he's already underwater. He needed this wedding, Marcus. Needed it to merge his logistics contracts with whatever your engineering firm's patents are worth. Without that deal, I don't think he has the runway he's pretending he has." Marcus sat with that for a moment, turning it over. "Why are you telling me this? Because you deserve to know what you were actually caught in the middle of," she said. "It was never really about you being good enough. It was about my father needing something from your firm and being embarrassed enough about needing it that he decided the only way to feel powerful in the situation was to make sure everyone in that room understood he was doing you a favor." She finally looked up and met his eyes. "You were never beneath us, Marcus. My father just needed you to believe you were so he wouldn't have to admit how much he needed you." Marcus didn't tell her about Battery Point Holdings. He didn't tell her about Isaiah or the reversionary clause buried on page 15 of a contract her father had signed without reading, or the fact that the man she'd just described as desperate and drowning had 4 days earlier handed his own downfall to a bell repairman for $5,000. Some things he understood without needing me to tell him don't belong to people who haven't earned them yet, however genuine their guilt might be. "Thank you for telling me," he said instead. "I don't expect anything from that. I just couldn't keep sitting on it." They didn't hug goodbye. They didn't promise to stay in touch. Marcus told me he watched her walk out first, back straight, the posture of a woman rebuilding herself, out of pieces she wasn't sure yet how to arrange. And he sat alone at that mismatched table for another 20 minutes before he trusted himself to drive. He came straight to the workshop from there, still in his work clothes, and found me at the casting bench, going over the following week's commissions with Desmond on speakerphone. He waited until the call ended before he spoke. "Preston's more desperate than he's letting on," Marcus said. "Vanessa thinks he's underwater on the crypto losses, using the tower project and the wedding merger to cover it. She doesn't know the specifics. But she's scared for him in her own way even after everything." I set down the mold I'd been inspecting. "That tracks with what Old Habits, has been finding in the public filings," I said. "But it's useful to hear it confirmed from inside the house, instead of just inferred from the outside." Marcus sat down heavily on the stool across from me, exhaustion catching up with him all at once. "I don't know what to do with any of this. I don't trust her. I don't think I should trust her. But I don't think she was lying either." "You don't have to trust her," I said. "You just have to use what she gave you." He looked up at me. "That's a cold way to put it." "It's an honest way to put it," I said. "There's a difference, same as I told you about the land. She made her choice at that wedding, same as everyone else in that room. What she's offering you now doesn't undo it. It just means she's decided the truth is worth more to her than her father's approval, at least for tonight. We'll see if that holds." This part I didn't learn until much later. After the gala, after everything that came with it, Grant told it to me himself. Sitting across a table in circumstances I'll get to. But it belongs here in the order it happened, not the order I found out. He went back to the records office 3 more times that week. Each visit a little later in the day, a little more careful about which clerk he asked for the file. He told himself it was diligence. It wasn't, not entirely. Some part of him had already understood on some level he wasn't ready to name that whatever he was circling had teeth. On the 4th visit, he brought a legal pad instead of his notebook, and he laid out every document from the Ashworth chain of title, alongside the Battery Point lien filings side by side on the long table under the fluorescent lights, and he started tracing dates. Isaiah Ashworth's parcel transferred under duress in 1951. Purchased by Elias Calloway's holding company. Battery Point Holdings incorporated in the state records 31 years ago, its registered agent, a law office he didn't recognize. Its beneficial ownership shielded behind 2 layers of trust structure that would take a forensic accountant, not a due diligence officer, to fully unwind. But he didn't need to unwind all of it. He only needed one thread. And he found it on his 4th visit in a filing so old and so unremarkable that nobody in 70 years had bothered to flag it. A supplemental deed correction filed 11 years ago, quietly updating an address of record for tax notices related to the original 1951 parcel. The address led to a workshop on the edge of town. The workshop belonged to a man named Cornelius Ashworth. For a moment, Grant didn't move at all. The fluorescent light above the table buzzed faintly, one bulb flickering half a beat behind the others. Somewhere across the room, a clerk stamped a document, the sound flat and final in the quiet. He could hear the vending machine in the hallway cycle its compressor on with a low mechanical shudder. He set his pen down on the legal pad without writing anything else, and he sat there for a long moment, simply looking at the 2 names on the table in front of him. Isaiah Ashworth, Cornelius Ashworth, without letting himself connect them out loud. As if saying it in his own head first might somehow make it less true. Grant sat with that for a long time. He told me later that the fluorescent lights had started to feel like they were humming louder than they had any right to, that he'd read the name 3 times before it fully connected to anything, and that when it did connect, his first feeling wasn't triumph at having solved the puzzle Preston sent him to solve. It was dread, specific and total. The particular dread of a man realizing the file he wrote 3 weeks ago, the one that called an old man harmless clean exactly what he appeared to be, had missed the only detail that actually mattered. He didn't call Preston. He told himself he needed to verify it further, and that was true as far as it went. But it wasn't the whole truth, and he knew it wasn't. The whole truth was that he didn't yet know what it would cost him to be the man who'd handed Preston Calloway a folder, confidently declaring Cornelius Ashworth harmless 3 weeks before that same man turned out to be the shadow owner of the lien clouding Preston's own building. He drove home instead. Sat in his car in the driveway for 20 minutes before he went inside. Camille found him at the kitchen table an hour later. Still in his work clothes, a legal pad in front of him. He'd turned face down the moment he heard her key in the door. She set her purse down on the counter and kicked off her heels, one at a time. The small domestic sounds of a woman arriving home from a day she assumed had been ordinary. "You've been off all week," she said, not quite a question. "Work thing. The battery point thing." He looked up at her, and something in his face must have told her more than he intended, because her expression shifted from idle curiosity into something sharper. "Grant, what did you find?" "Nothing I'm ready to talk about yet. My father asked you 3 days ago to find out who's behind that company. If you found something he needs to know, that's your job. I know what my job is. Then do it." She sat down across from him, voice softening the particular softness she used when she wanted something, and had decided gentleness would get it faster than pressure. "There's an invitation on the counter for you, by the way. The gala. Daddy wants us all there. The whole family. A united front, especially after the wedding. He's been saying it all week, how important it is that everyone shows up, polished, no loose threads." She reached across and turned his legal pad face up, glancing at it before he could stop her, though she couldn't have made sense of the shorthand notes scrawled across it. "Whatever this is, Grant, don't let it be a loose thread, not this week. He's under enough pressure already." "You don't know the half of what he's under," Grant said, quieter than he meant to. Camille went still. "What does that mean?" He didn't answer her. He gathered the legal pad, folded it in half, and told her he needed to think, and she let him go upstairs without pressing further. Though I'd learned later that his silence that night bothered her more than any answer would have. He sat alone in his study for the rest of the evening, the cream-colored gala invitation propped against his desk lamp, where Camille had left it earlier. Gold-embossed letters catching the light every time he shifted in his chair. Somewhere in the house he could hear Camille on the phone with her sister. Voices too low to make out words, the particular hum of a family closing ranks around something it didn't fully understand yet. The invitation sat there the whole time, patient and expensive-looking, waiting for an answer he wasn't ready to give it. He didn't sleep much that night. He kept thinking about the file he'd written, clean, thorough, confident, calling a man harmless who owned, as far as Grant could now tell, more of Beaufort County than the family Grant had married into. He kept thinking about the word he'd used in his report. Clean. He'd been so certain. That was the part that sat heaviest, not that he'd been wrong, but that he'd been so sure he couldn't be. Desmond came to the workshop the night before the gala, with a briefcase full of paperwork and the particular calm of a man who has spent 31 years preparing for a single evening and finally sees the shape of it arriving on schedule. He'd traded his usual suit for something plainer dark slacks and a sweater, the closest thing to casual I'd seen him wear in a decade, as if even his wardrobe understood tomorrow required a different kind of readiness than any courtroom had. "Everything's filed," he said, spreading documents across the workbench between the half-finished bell molds, each stack weighted down with a casting tool because the window was cracked and the night had turned breezy. "The reversionary clause is triggered and recorded pending only the public disclosure event. The Isaiah Ashworth chain of title is fully reconstructed and notarized. I've briefed 2 reporters I trust to be in that room tomorrow, though neither of them knows why yet. Battery Point's ownership structure is ready to be unwound in front of witnesses the moment you give the word. He looked at me over his glasses. This is the part where I ask you one more time if you're certain. I'm certain. I had to ask. Marcus stood near the casting floor, arms crossed, watching the two of us with the particular stillness of a man trying to memorize a moment he understands he'll want to remember clearly later. He'd been quiet most of the evening, working through something I recognized because I'd worked through versions of it myself for 4 decades. "Can I ask you something?" he said, once Desmond had stepped out to take a call, his footsteps fading toward the far end of the workshop where the reception was better. "Always. Are you sure this is what you want?" He wasn't looking at me when he said it, examining instead a cooled bar of bronze on the workbench, turning it over in his hands. "Not what's owed, not what's fair. What you actually want, tomorrow night, standing in front of all those people. Because I've watched you plan this for weeks now, with the same face you use for reading scripture. And I don't know if that face means peace, or something else you haven't let yourself name yet." It was a fair question, and a sharper one than I expected from him. And for a moment I found myself without an answer I trusted enough to give out loud. I laughed instead. It came out short and strange. Nothing like my usual laugh, more air than sound. And Marcus looked up at me with something close to alarm, because in 4 decades he had heard me laugh at very little, and had certainly never heard me laugh at a question that deserved a real answer. "That's not an answer," he said. "No," I agreed. "It isn't." I didn't explain it further, and to his credit, he didn't push. Some questions a man has to sit with unanswered a while longer before he trusts himself to speak on them. And I understood, watching my son watch me, that he'd just seen something in me I hadn't shown him before. Not the confidence he'd been leaning on all week, but the thin, uncertain seam underneath it. Across town, in a house considerably grander than my workshop, Camille found the copy Grant had made. He'd been careful about it, or thought he had a second thumb drive, kept in a drawer beneath his winter sweaters, separate from the one Preston's people would eventually demand he surrender. But Camille had never once in her marriage respected the concept of a drawer that wasn't also hers, and she found it while looking for something else entirely. A receipt for a dry cleaner, and recognized immediately from the label in Grant's careful handwriting that it wasn't nothing. "What is this?" she said, holding it up when he came upstairs. "Nothing you need. Grant." Her voice had the flat, final quality it took on when patience had run out somewhere behind her eyes. "My father asked you a direct question 3 days ago. You've been distracted, cagey, sleeping in the study, and now I find a hidden drive labeled in your handwriting? Tell me what's on it," he told her. Not everything, not yet. Not the full shape of what he suspected, but enough. Isaiah Ashworth. The 1951 transfer. The address that led to a bell repairman's workshop. Enough that her face went through several expressions in quick succession. Confusion, disbelief, something that briefly resembled fear before settling on something rigid and controlled. The family posture she'd learned from her father. Without ever noticing she'd learned it. "You need to destroy that," she said. "Camille, the gala is tomorrow. My father has half the city's investors and 2 reporters coming to watch him launch the biggest project of his career. And you're telling me there's a live grenade sitting in our house that could go off at any moment if the wrong person finds it first?" She held the drive out to him, not quite an offer, closer to a demand dressed as one. "Destroy it. Tonight. Whatever it means. Whatever you think you owe some old man you've never met, it isn't worth blowing up everything my family has built." He took the drive back from her. He told her he would handle it. She watched him walk to the kitchen, watched him hold it over the sink, watched, she'd tell me much later, in a conversation I never expected to have with her directly, what looked like him running it briefly under the tap and dropping the ruined drive into the trash. What she didn't watch, because he made certain she didn't, was the second copy he'd already made an hour earlier and mailed that same evening in an unmarked envelope to a lawyer downtown he'd once done a favor for and never called in the debt. Some men, when finally cornered by their own conscience, choose loudly. Grant chose quietly, the way most real choices actually get made, not in a speech but in the small, unwitnessed decision of which drive to ruin and which one to keep. Marcus and I left the workshop a little before midnight. Rain had started again, light more mist than storm, and we stood in the doorway a moment before stepping out into it. The workshop behind us sat dark, except for one lamp Desmond had left burning over his stack of documents. A small square of yellow light in an otherwise black building. The last quiet thing before tomorrow. Tomorrow, Marcus said. Tomorrow, I agreed. Neither of us said anything else. We walked out to the truck together into a night that smelled like rain and cooling metal toward whatever version of morning was waiting on the other side of it. The Callaway Exchange Hall expansion opened on a Saturday evening, under a sky the color of a bruise just starting to heal. Gold lights spilling out of floor-to-ceiling windows onto a plaza still smelling faintly of fresh concrete. Preston had spared nothing. String quartet by the entrance, champagne towers, 3 stories of glass, a red carpet laid across pavement that had been raw earth 6 weeks earlier. Earth I happen to know a great deal about, since half of it sat on a parcel my family had lost in 1951, and I had spent 31 years quietly buying back. Valets in white gloves waved luxury cars toward a lot that used to be, before Preston's crews cleared it, a stand of pines I'd walked past my whole life on the way to church. I wore the same charcoal suit I'd worn to my son's wedding. I wanted that detail to matter, and it did, though almost no one in that room understood why yet. A woman near the entrance glanced at me twice. The second look longer than the first, the particular double-take of someone trying to place a face out of context and failing. Marcus walked beside me, sharper now, in a suit Desmond had insisted on, though we'd both agreed the point wasn't to look like the Callaways. The point was to look like exactly what we were, and let the room decide what that meant once it finally understood. Preston found the podium a little after 8, tapping the microphone with the same easy confidence he'd worn at his daughter's wedding. A man who had never once considered that confidence might be a debt he hadn't finished paying. Tonight, he said, voice carrying, warm and practiced across a room full of investors, reporters, the mayor. We celebrate more than a building. We celebrate a legacy. He gestured at the glass tower rising behind him, lit gold against the darkening sky. The Callaway name has meant something in this city for 6 generations. Tonight, we build the 7th. Desmond moved before the applause finished dying. He walked up the center aisle unhurried, a leather folder under one arm. The posture of a man who has waited 3 decades for a specific 15 seconds and intends to use every one of them correctly. Security stepped toward him. I lifted one hand from where I stood near the back, a small gesture, and the guard who'd been briefed weeks earlier for exactly this stepped aside instead. "Mr. Callaway," Desmond said, reaching the base of the podium, voice pitched to carry without shouting. "Before you continue, there's a matter of public record you'll want addressed tonight in front of these witnesses, rather than in a courtroom next week." Preston's smile didn't fully leave his face. It just went brittle around the edges. "I don't know you." "You will." Desmond opened the folder. "My name is Desmond Okafor. I represent Battery Point Holdings, the entity holding the reversionary lien on the parcel beneath this building. The lien your own counsel discovered 3 weeks ago and failed to resolve before signing a contract with a morality clause you never read past the signature line." A murmur went through the crowd, uncertain the particular sound of a room realizing it's watching something it wasn't invited to, but can't look away from. "This is absurd," Preston said, but his eyes had already found me standing near the back, in a suit he recognized, and something in his face began slowly to come apart. I walked forward. The crowd parted the way crowds do when they sense weight shifting towards someone. Phones rising in the same instinctive gesture I'd watched at the wedding. Except this time I was the one they were pointing them at. "You called me trash at my son's wedding," I said, close enough to the podium now that I didn't need Desmond's microphone trick. Close enough that Preston could hear every word without amplification. You held up a folder with 3 weeks of my finances in it and told 400 people I was worth less than the wine on your table. You're the... Preston's voice cracked disbelief and recognition, arriving at once. You're Lester. The father. You're the... Cornelius Ashworth, I said. Chairman of Battery Point Holdings. Grandson of Isaiah Ashworth, who owned the 80 acres beneath this building until your great-grandfather's company took it from him in 1951 under a tax scheme designed for exactly that purpose. I reached into my jacket and set the cracked bronze disc on the edge of the podium where the light caught its tarnished surface. I have spent 31 years buying back every piece of paper connected to that land, Preston. Quietly. Patiently. The way a man builds something meant to last instead of something meant to be photographed. The room had gone fully silent. Now the specific silence of several hundred people simultaneously recalculating everything they thought they understood about the evening they'd dressed up for. Somewhere in the crowd, a reporter's pen had stopped moving entirely, hovering over her notepad. Grant stepped forward from where he'd been standing beside Camille near the family's reserve section. He didn't look at Preston. He looked at me and then at the folder in Desmond's hand, and something settled in his face. Not relief, not yet. Something closer to the specific stillness of a man finally choosing which side of a line to stand on. I wrote the report, Grant said, loud enough to carry. Loud enough that Preston's head snapped toward him. 3 weeks ago, I told Mr. Calloway that Cornelius Ashworth was harmless, clean, exactly what he appeared to be. He held up a small drive I hadn't seen before, the second copy. The one Camille never knew survived the sink. I was wrong. And I have documentation showing exactly how wrong including the parcel history connecting this building's foundation to land my father-in-law's family took under a discriminatory tax ordinance in 1951. I'm making it available to every reporter in this room tonight. Preston's face had gone the color of old plaster. Grant, what are you doing? My job, Grant said. Finally. I let the silence hold a moment longer, the way you let a struck bell finish ringing before you speak again. Because interrupting that particular silence would have wasted the only thing 40 years of patience had actually earned me. I'm not here to destroy your company, Preston, I said, and I meant it, though I watched him not believe me. I'm here to correct a public record that's been wrong for 73 years. What happens to Kensington Logistics? To this tower to your name that was decided the moment you signed a contract you never bothered reading. The same way my grandfather was forced to sign one he never had a choice about. Somewhere behind me, I heard Marcus exhale, long and slow. The sound of a man watching the last piece of a puzzle he'd spent weeks assembling finally click into place. In public, in front of everyone who'd ever doubted either of us. I picked the bronze disc back up off the podium. My hand, I noticed distantly, was not entirely steady, a small tremor I hadn't felt since the night of the wedding. Arriving now, of all moments, when the thing I'd waited 31 years to say had finally been said, in full, in front of witnesses, in a room built on my grandfather's stolen land. I didn't say anything else. I turned the disc over once in my palm, feeling the crack along its edge the way I'd felt it 10,000 times before. The room held its silence a moment longer. Somewhere near the bar, a champagne cork popped entirely by accident, a caterer's hand slipping at the worst possible instant, and the small sound cracked through the quiet like something much larger. Nobody laughed. A single camera shutter clicked, then another, a scattered rhythm building slowly into a steady patter. Outside, through the tall windows, I could see the reflection of the harbor lights rippling faintly against the glass, and beneath the murmur just beginning to rise in the crowd, I heard very clearly the low mechanical hum of the building's own climate system, cycling on, indifferent to everything that had just happened beneath it. For the first time in 4 decades, standing in front of 200 flashing phones and a man whose empire had just quietly ended, I let my hand shake without trying to hide it. 4 days after the gala, Grant Sutter stood in front of a bank of cameras outside the county courthouse and said in a voice steadier than I expected from a man who'd spent the previous week losing most of what he thought his life was built on, that his original background investigation into Cornelius Ashworth had been incomplete, and that the omission had contributed materially to events that followed. He didn't blame anyone else for it. I watched the footage later at home, and I noticed that how he stood there and simply owned the failure, without reaching for Preston's name or Camille's or anyone's but his own. It's a rarer thing than people assume, a man taking a fall cleanly, without trying to soften the landing by pointing at someone standing nearby. Camille left him 2 weeks later. I heard that secondhand too, the way I hear most things about that family now. And I felt less satisfaction in it than I expected to. There's a particular emptiness in watching a marriage end as collateral damage in a war it never signed up to fight. Preston's collapse, when it came the way Desmond had always said it would, not from any single blow, but from the accumulated weight of a dozen small ones landing at once. The morality clause triggered the day the story broke. First Citibank called its loans within the week. Kensington Logistics filed for reorganization 11 days after the gala, and the Tower project, the one meant to be his seventh generation's monument, sat half-finished behind chain-link fencing while lawyers argued over what remained of it. I drove past it once, weeks later, on my way to a supplier upstate, and I made myself look at it the whole way. Past the exposed rebar, the cranes gone still, the enormous Callaway sign still bolted to scaffolding nobody had bothered to take down. Not out of triumph, but because I'd decided a man should look directly at the consequences of what he sets in motion, even the parts that don't feel as clean as he'd hoped they would. Vanessa called Marcus once a month after the gala, not asking for anything, just wanting him to know she'd left her father's company entirely and taken a job in another state. He told me about the call the same evening it happened, sitting at this same kitchen table, and neither of us said much about what it meant. Some stories end without a clean moral attached to them. Hers was still being written, same as everyone's. I could have taken everything. Desmond had built the mechanism to do exactly that, patient and thorough the way he builds everything. I chose not to. "You're leaving him the house?" Marcus said when I told him, sitting across the kitchen table from me, in the shack that had never once in 40 years looked like what it actually sat on top of. "I'm leaving him and Patricia the house," I said. "Not the tower. Not the logistics fleet. Not the seat on the hospital board he cared about more than either. The house and enough left over that they won't end up in the kind of poverty that breaks a person's spirit the way it broke Isaiah's." I turned the coffee cup in my hands. I spent 31 years deciding what kind of man I wanted to be on the other side of this Marcus. I decided a long time ago it wasn't going to be a man who took everything just because he finally could. He didn't extend you that same mercy. No, I agreed. He didn't. That's the difference between the two of us, and I intend to keep it that way. Marcus was quiet a moment, turning something over in his jacket pocket, the way he'd done 100 times without my ever mentioning it. He pulled it out and set it on the table between us. The small copper disc, worn smooth now from years of handling, the one I'd cast for him when he was 10 years old, for no occasion at all. "I still have it," he said. "Every year I thought about losing it somewhere, and every year I didn't." I looked at it a long moment. "I know. I've watched you carry it since you were a boy. You never said anything." There wasn't anything that needed saying. I made it so you'd have something from my hands that wasn't a chore or an instruction. I didn't need to know you kept it. I just needed it to exist in case you ever did. He picked it back up, turned it once between his fingers, and for the first time since the wedding, I watched something in my son's face settle all the way down. Not relief, exactly, closer to a kind of permanence. The specific stillness of a man who has finally stopped waiting to understand his own life and started simply living inside it. I stood and walked to the workshop's back room, to the drawer where the cracked bell mold had sat for 4 decades, untouched, except for the handful of times I'd taken it out to look at it, and put it back without doing anything else. I brought it out to the table and set it down next to Marcus's copper disc, the 2 pieces of the same story sitting side by side for the first time in either of their lives. "I'm going to cast a new bell," I said, "from this mold. I've had the pattern repaired, not erased, repaired, the crack still visible in the finished piece because I don't believe in pretending a wound never happened, just because you've decided to stop carrying it the same way. I want it to hang somewhere that matters. A church, maybe, somewhere Isaiah would have recognized. Will it ring true, with the crack still in it? I don't know yet, I said honestly. That's part of why I want to try. Some things you don't get to know the answer to until you've done the work and listened for yourself. I reached into my other pocket and set the key to the bunker's steel door on the table beside both pieces of copper. Marcus looked at it, then at me. There's no door left in this house I'm keeping locked from you, I said. Not the workshop, not the bunker, not anything Battery Point owns or owes. I spent your whole life deciding what you were ready to know, and I understand now that decision was never really mine to make alone. You're going to run this someday. Better that you learn it beside me, with both eyes open, instead of inheriting it the way I did, alone, in the dark, 40 years too late to ask anyone the questions that mattered. Marcus picked up the key, weighing it in his palm. The way you weigh something you understand is heavier than its size suggests. Okay, he said. Teach me. That evening, after he'd gone home, I walked out to the workshop alone and stood over the casting bench for a long while, the repaired mold and a crucible of bronze waiting for the following morning's pour. I thought about Isaiah standing at the edge of a river that no longer belonged to him, pointing at land and naming crops like a prayer he couldn't stop saying. I thought about a folder held up under a spotlight and a word trash that had traveled further than the man who'd said it ever intended. All the way back to a debt 73 years old, finally, imperfectly beginning to come due. I picked up the mold one more time before locking the workshop for the night, running my thumb along the crack the way I had 10,000 times before. For the first time since I was 12 years old, standing at that same riverbank beside my father, it didn't feel like a wound I was keeping. It felt like a shape I was finally ready to pour something new into. 3 months later, a new bell hung in the tower of Mount Zion Baptist, half a mile from where Isaiah Ashworth's house once stood. If you looked closely at its shoulder in a certain slant of morning light, you could still see the hairline seam where the old crack had been repaired, not erased. Nobody who heard it ring on a Sunday morning ever asked about the seam. They just heard it ring true and went inside. I used to believe that taking back what's stolen from you was simple arithmetic. Subtract what he owes, add it to what's yours, and call the balance justice. I don't believe that anymore. Isaiah taught me the wound. Preston Calloway taught me the weight of finally settling it. But it was my son who taught me the harder truth. That justice done entirely in silence, however patient, however precise, is still its own kind of theft. Theft from the people who love you, robbed of the chance to stand beside you while you carry it. I got my land back. What I nearly lost in the getting of it was the one person that land was ever supposed to be for. I think about Isaiah some nights, out on a porch he never got to keep. And I hope wherever he is, God let him see how it ended. I think my grandfather would tell me I waited too long, and God, I believe he'd be right to say it. But I have to trust God has a use even for a slow man's patience if that man finally puts it down at the right door before it's too late. My son still carries a small piece of copper I made him at 10 years old. I still carry the crack I could never quite fix alone. If you were me, if you'd waited 40 years and the door finally swung open, would you have taken everything, the way he tried to take everything from us? Or would you have left him the house the way I did, and called that mercy instead of weakness? Tell me in the comments what you would have done, and what silence has ever cost your own family, while you waited for the right moment to end it. And if this story found you tonight, stay close. There are more people out there who waited too long, same as I did, and more truths still quietly coming due.